Hello, everyone. We're very happy to have Ranjodh Singh Dhaliwal with us today. Ranjodh is a scholar looking at the intersections of media theory, science, and technology studies. Currently an associate professor at the University of Notre Dame, he also makes video games and other digital projects as part of his exploration of the many facets of computational media. Welcome, and please, Ranjodh, take it away.
Thank you so much for having me here, Louis-Philippe and Guy. I'm really thrilled to be in conversation with you. I'm gonna try to share some portion of my screen. Okay, I'm assuming everything's okay, because if it wouldn't be, you'll let me know. Okay, so thanks again for having me here. I'm really excited to have a conversation with you and to participate in what seems like a really fascinating sort of putting together of people from all over studying these concepts and ideas that I think I'm very interested in. So, okay, I'm going to be talking about some of my really new work. I'm titling this talk, Some Programming Folktales, The Material Semiotic Limits of Professional Discourse. Okay, so I generally work on the politico-economic and socio-cultural histories and theories of computational media. Today, I'm going to pick on one of these threads and talk about a moment in the history of computing when stories in Usenet groups repeated over water coolers became the primary mode of creative and socioeconomic reckoning of the new emerging profession, the profession of computer programming. My book project, more generally, my first book project tries to ask, what is computing? Sort of historically, politico-economically, socioculturally, and ontologically. Computing, we know, is not calculation, and it's not digitality, and it's not quantification. So what exactly is computing is my sort of a question more specifically. In that project, I offer a conceptual framework that thinks about the cultural logics of technology while incorporating the wide variety of computings that we already live with today, right? So digital computing and analog computing and human computing, but also quantum computing now. So I use approaches from science fiction studies, science and technology studies, and critical media theory in order to kind of do this. In doing so, I investigate the political, aesthetic, and technical entanglements in the discourse around computer architecture and computer graphics over the last 150 years or so, going slightly further back in some cases. So in my work, precisely because I'm searching for the cultural, aesthetic, and politico-economic underpinnings, computer science and science fiction form a tight network, each taking concepts, formal elements, and aesthetic dimensions from the other. The fictional construction of computing, then, I argue, is studied best through a literary critical examination of science fictions and scientific fictions together. A part of it is about literary readings of canonical, popular, and non-literary texts altogether, but a part of it is methodologies coming from STS and media studies as well. So I'll give an example in my talk today, but for now, I'll just state that following Kate Hales and Donna Haraway, I locate science fictional rhetorical moves in sort of actual computer science and computing experiments in science fiction, to a point where the distinction between the two is perhaps not possible, but definitely not useful for me. So that explains the sort of term computer science fiction as one that I use. So on one side of computer science fiction is the study of science fiction, right? So think about cyberpunk or hard science fiction, stories that actively think about science as such. So stories that try to experiment with science. There is this intimate feedback loop between science fictional figurations at work in the history of technology and the fiction that millions of science fiction readers read worldwide. So many of the science fiction writers, including some on the screen, Cory Doctorow, Neil Stephenson, William Gibson, others as well, are either computing professionals themselves or socially and culturally plugged into technology communities. So they talk to and write in computing magazines and even speak in academic conferences. So this discourse kind of sort of becomes one short circuit where sort of computing as a practice, profession, and sort of the world of technology sort of fuses with its representations and fictional representations. The other side of this, and this is another methodological thread that I follow, is the fictionality in science. So science and technology experts that I often study, like John von Neumann or John Lasseter or Oliver Selfridge, they're all often open about having their work being inspired by some kind of fiction or its tropes. That's the kind of more direct relationship. But there's also other times that sometimes explicit, but other times subtle science fictionalities that sneak into scientific narratives through metaphors and analogies. So thinking about technology in that case, again, becomes a part of like short-circuiting this computer science and science fiction together into what I'm calling computer science fictions. So let me elaborate. For the rest of the talk, my position on these questions with an example. Some of us in the humanities and social sciences may have heard of Edgar Allan Poe's famous story, The Purloined Letter. A story which is important to begin with, but ends up being granted an even more fabulous afterlife by Jacques Lacan, who uses it to theorize psychoanalytic subjectivity. In his seminar on The Purloined Letter, he says this, addressing what he calls our amateur cybernetic streak, Lacan illustrates how the letter functions as a signifier whose signified is irrelevant, and its purloining circuits an occasion for the very determination of subjectivity. Subjectivity, in Lacan's terms, is situated in a symbolic order and has no relation to the real, but rather to the syntax which is engendered by the signifying mark there. Now, these psychoanalytic proclamations and their limitations have already been studied and discussed at great lengths for decades. Even its relationship between cybernetics and its influence on Lacan is fairly clear, thanks to work by Lydia Liu, John Johnston, Adrian Johnston, Kate Hales, and so on. What is less clear, however, is the discursive uniqueness of these stories. In other words, I claim that Lacan's psychoanalytic framework can actually be best spotted not in the literary texts that he was looking at, but in the technocultural milieus that arose from the machines that he was looking at. Here, I want to investigate the Lacanesque underpinnings in the history of computational media by going back to the transmission and communication circuitry that Lacan's thought machinery so tantalizingly located. I attempt to trace this Lacanian conception of machinic subjectivity by triangulating it with the history of what Lacan called the thinking machines. Around a decade after Lacan wrote his Purloined Letter, we get the setting of a story that would eventually become what in computer programming folklore was called the story of Mel. I do want to kind of point out that he was actually looking at, when he says rotating memories, he's looking at drums and he's looking at actual computers that use those kind of drums. So my goal here is kind of tracing the historical specificity of theoretical discourse that otherwise claims to solely be emerging in some ways from a literary standpoint, but then becomes important for all kinds of humanistic and social scientific theoretical questions. So this brings me to computer programming folklore, the story of Mel. So the first thing to point out here is the computer programming folklore is a real term. It's a term that's used by people who participate in it, but also by scholars and observers who look at what's happening in these Usenet forums early on and say, wow, that's a lot like folktales. And so the first step is essentially taking it seriously as folklore and seeing where that takes us. So the story that I'm going to be focusing on is called The Story of Mel. The tale, first published in 1983 on Usenet, an early bulletin board by someone named Ed Nather, tells the tale of a legendary programmer. So you eventually find who the legendary programmer is, and it is this guy here who was, people had to actually do some excavation to find out like, who is this legendary programmer and what is he doing? Anyway, so the point is, this is the story, at least the start of the story. It's a long one. The first sentence here begins with talking about the notions of toxic masculinity in a professional culture, trying to find its footing after the scientific discipline, so computer science, becomes an industry, computer programming and computer engineering departments start growing up. So real programmers, it says, don't use Fortran, which is an ostensibly easier software coding language. Here, it's referring to a popular satire book about how real men don't eat quiche and sort of turning that. Instead, real programmer, like the mythic Mel, work with machine at the level of the machine. So they work with hardware, right? Or closer to hardware at least. The story follows a mystery. How did Mel implement a loop in his program which has no end condition and yet it terminates? Originally written as prose, but later converted to free verse, the story ends up in the discourse as a detective tale. Shades of Purloined Letter here, where an unnamed narrator tells the story of a genius operator, someone who is, to quote, male, raw, unadorned. So to read this out loud, real programmers write in Fortran. Maybe they do now in this decadent era of light beer, hand calculators, and user-friendly software. So already the implied judgment in there. But back in the good old days, capital G, capital O, when the term software sounded funny and real computers were made out of drums and vacuum tubes, real programmers wrote in machine code. Not Fortran, not Ratfor, not even assembly language, machine code. Raw, unadorned, inscrutable hexadecimal numbers directly. Lest a whole new generation of programmers grow up in ignorance of this glorious past, I feel duty-bound to describe as best as I can through the generation gap how a real programmer wrote code. I'll call him Mel because that was his name. And you already see the sort of kind of mythic form of the prose here, the sort of folklorish, to be sort of transmitted, running rhythm of the words. But in this story, I argue, like conceptual parallels to the detective tales that inform Lacan's theory of the cybernetic subject, what Lacan's call machinicity, you can kind of see that up front. For the center of the story here is not a missing letter as it was in the story of the Purloined Letter. It's literally a letter that's missing and then a detective finds it. And so the detective's gaze and this and that is basically what Lacan is studying. But here the missing letter is one of another kind. The missing letter is computer code. Computer code here is in some ways transforming from what semioticians would call code to what we would now call code in common parlance. This technology instead of that, the computational instead of epistolary, not only establishes a genealogy of Lacan's aftermath, but also absorbs within it the essential features of his concept. So I'm gonna sort of move forward to the tale. And again, I'm not even presenting the whole tale in its entirety, but the story is one where Mel is asked to make a blackjack program for some kind of, sort of public-facing location. And the blackjack program is actually pretty good. So the customers are sometimes unhappy at losing it. So he's asked to sort of basically write code that makes sure that the customers win. And he's ethically opposed to it because he thinks it's a game and should be played fairly. And so he writes the code very reluctantly, but the code actually ends up doing the opposite, which is to say the code ends up ensuring that the customers never win. And so he claims, well, I'm a righteous man. You couldn't have made me do anything else anyway. Even when I tried, my subconscious told me that you can't hoodwink people in a blackjack game. But this whole story is set in the middle of like almost like a corporate tale, right? Let's see. You would see, where's that? I was trying to run through it. Anyway, but there are like dollar signs all over when he's talking about his own practice. He eventually leaves the company, probably for better pay, it is told. Mel's code was a real adventure, sort of borrowing from the sort of tales of adventure. And the fact that he's very clear about how his subconscious was uncontrollably ethical and adamantly refusing to fix it. So it's a more sort of visual and explicit laying out of similar concepts to what sort of, again, Lacan was using a very different kind of technology to do. So it's the fact that this is set within a corporate world, in a newly emerging corporate world, the world of computer programming as a service. You see basically Lacan's concept of the big other, which Zizek, when reading Lacan, actually claims clearly stands in for the politico-economic big other, that is the politico-economic system itself. So again, it should be no coincidence that the big boss here, the capital B, has the same shades of the big O as the Lacanian reading of circuits of communication. So all adventure stories have an end, all detective stories have a final revelation. My point in bringing the story to bear on this history is to A, show how texts outside kind of literature or even conventional sort of folklore or mythologies that maybe anthropologists might study, more specifically texts in technical professional folklore, provide these generative locations for thinking and rethinking with theoretical questions that are otherwise well-versed and invested in by all of us. So folklore is not just an anthropological interest in other places in this case and times, but also can be seen within recent histories of technology and professional discourse. Two, I argue that there are these very close relations between fictional forms and technical documents and practices. These relations not only blur the boundary between technoscientific rhetoric and cultural discourse, but they also showcase the fictionalities and figurations embedded in sciences and their paratexts, which is why computer science fictions as a way of construing these two worlds together is a bit of a world building, a bit of a speculation, I argue. And I think that's one of the possible methodological ways forward for studying our technoscientifically saturated media cultures today. But more specifically in the story, this story, I argue, indexes the linguistic and social limits of computational programming as hardware programming. It showcases the anxieties, ethical, cultural, gendered, classed anxieties of a rapidly changing technical economy, where work was moving away from an engagement with the physical to an engagement with the purely symbolic. At an economic scale, this was from physical to cognitive labor, or from products to services, or from capitalism to late capitalism, or industrial capitalism to late capitalism. These shifts were not extraneous to identities such as Mel's, but were integral in the very formation of linguistic, subjective, and cultural notions of programming. The language of the story of the Mel then provides us with the paratextual origins of a new symbolic economy at scale. It is in these stories that we find code emerging as an action and not merely the product. It is here that the everyday engagement of a new language finds its match in the communicative desire for the old ones. It is here that Lacan's machinicity gets captured by the big O other, for the machine undergoing transformation is not the symbolic mechanical operator of a now defunct company, but the standardizing and symbolizing capacities of the professionally shifting politico-economic post-human. The machine, which is to say Mel, was now at work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant. I have a lot of questions already. I might, but I think Felipe might want to start, and then we'll go from there.
Yes. I think the first question is just to get us into the core of your project. But before we get there, we would like for you to talk a bit about your trajectory, because we know we made, this the movement. We could say lateral movement, but that would be first ignore, the hierarchies that operate in academia. So we would say vertical movement, or like going up and actually descending into the humanities from computer science. So if you could speak about this passage from your training in CS to go into humanities, and how much of that movement actually informs your current intellectual project in thinking about computation from historical, socioeconomic perspectives and literary perspectives.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, so I trained as a computer scientist and engineer for my undergrad, but I quickly understood, I guess it was in some ways the call of the political subconscious, not necessarily unconscious, that drew me to ask slightly different questions. I think, I mean, if we study competition even today, it's loaded with these metaphors that I don't think are tough to spot, even as someone who may or may not be trained in humanistic and social scientific inquiry, right? Like up until recently, we're still talking about master slave hard disks, or we still are talking about sort of parallel processing, or things that actually, when they need to be defined in these interesting ways that lead you to histories of the world and theories of the world that are far beyond the computational itself, right? Even the situation of the computational, like when I was in the computer science world, it was pretty obvious to me that there was, in some ways, this missing piece of action between technology, and this missing piece of understanding between technology and action, that us as computer science practitioners had in some ways a really short route from understanding the technicalities of things to applying them in the world for the service of X, right? The X could be a state actor or an institutional framework of any kind. So I think some of my initial, I guess, desires to know more stemmed from that. I think it also probably happened because I was trained in a part of the world where we did not have a lot of cultural sort of training alongside a technical training, right? I was trained in a technical school, and so it was more like being smitten by like what is on the other side of the whale that I wasn't clearly taught, but like I know that some people know in the other parts of the world. So that led me to sort of seek training in media theory and history and literature and other sort of bits and pieces of other subdisciplines around it, visual cultural studies and anthropology and STS. And in some ways that still forms some of the core components of how I work and what I work on. I think one of my practices is the steadfast belief that I do generally have my primary texts not to be literary objects as they generally would be in a literature sort of training and standpoint, but technical objects. It's about sort of understanding, just the way that you'd understand a literary or a cultural object, understanding technologies and their practices and their histories and theories. Yeah, I think that's essentially the contours of how it works, and in some ways that's still at the very core of what I work on. I mean, my bigger book project is literally in some ways starting with me breaking down a machine, like an actual sort of tearing up a machine and seeing what, like, to answer the question of what is computation, I kind of quite literally and then conceptually break open the computer. So it's very much a part of my practice. It'd be interesting to see how that transforms in the future. I think some of my forthcoming projects will probably move in different directions and think about technicalities slightly differently. But I think my initial foray into the world of humanities and social sciences has been very directly coming from the questions that I wanted answered as a computer science practitioner, as a 20-something-year-old stupid undergrad.
That's really good. But we know that undergraduate sort of education tends to leave a strong mark in and when we are young, like you said, like a 20-year-old, and those things tend to stay sometimes. And I wanted to maybe provoke you a little bit and ask you if there's anything that you think in your computer science background that gets in the way of understanding these technical objects. Are there any moments that you say, like, that you think, I don't know, maybe you're looking at the way Kubernetes work and how everything is described as workers, and you can kill workers and then you can respawn workers at will. And maybe you think, wow, but maybe that's just a name. It's just, you could have used any other name, but maybe that's just a name. Or yeah, if that makes sense. Does it get in the way sometimes?
Totally, absolutely. And I think that's actually you hit the nail on the head. That's in some ways, I think, the bigger challenge. I wouldn't say necessarily the challenge being that, well, maybe. I'm not really sure. I guess I'm trying to think about what exactly the relationship between what gets in the way of what. But I know that there is some kind of aporia in the coexistence of the humanistic and social scientific and the techno-scientific within my own head and practice. Now, that's not to say that that's how it generally is. I mean, I think generally I would tend to construe these as, I'm someone who, like, apart from, maybe one discipline, which I won't say which one, I think all disciplines can coexist and actually are additive and supplemental and do new things. And it's not one or the other, but it's like always an and a function for me. But but there is nevertheless, I think, an aporia, which mostly manifests for me for when I am actually making technical objects, right? So I still make video games and still code, and it is in those moments that, like, I'm far slower now than I used to be, even though I've coded more, is because I think every single step for me is now laden with these other things that I understand. So in some ways, I actually wish that I could, like, switch that part of my brain off and say, I'm not going to think about the history of pointing when I'm, like, just, coding a pointer in here, that this is not going to lead me to want to write an addendum to my piece on addressability because I'm thinking whatever. So the point is, like, I think there's that giant aporia. It's also an aporia at another scales, the scale of kind of utilitarianism versus sort of thinking with something richly and deeply. And then I think there is the final question, which is that I have trouble still at some times sort of, I take a few seconds, if not like a few passes, at some kind of humanistic and social scientific discourse that I do not find expressed in the formal manner that I would expect the techno-scientific writings expressed. So let me rephrase that. In other words, there are certain kinds of writing that I gravitate towards where it's not necessarily about the complexity, but it's about the clarity that I like desire, which I think is completely coming from like my computer science background, right? So if you leave me into something, I'll really, like a piece of writing, I'll appreciate its like creativity and expression for a brief bit, but sooner or later I want a definition, or like you're trying to, you're starting to lose me. And I think that's totally a function of my sort of computer science background, because like I was initially trained to think a certain way, and it's an epistemological problem that I'm still grappling with. I think I'm reminded of this anecdote that, who was it? I think it was at some conference. I think, oh yes, I think it was Benjamin Bratton who at some conference was like talking about how it's often the case that asking humanists how they think technologies work is often more interesting, like hearing their answers is often more interesting than trying to actually describe how they work. So he had his whole thing about like asking Zizek how he thought Google search worked. And apparently the answer was like significantly more interesting than how any of us could ever otherwise imagine Google search would work if we knew how Google search works. right? So I think there's like these creative moments that open up nevertheless, regardless of those aporias, which I'm like really fascinated by. So like, I want to hear all of that. Like, I want to hear people who do not know how it works talk about how it works, because I think that's actually the bigger insight than someone who actually knows how it works, because then he already knows what he's saying, right? There's very little discovery in the sort of process of finding out. That's what I'll say on that.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yes. So I have a follow-up question that speaks to your answer. So I think we all have been dealing with these divisions, divides, and tensions, aporias, etc. Like Guilherme works as a programmer. He's an anthropologist. I happen to have to work in data management and programming, even though I'm an anthropology, and you also write code and work as in humanities and social sciences. So we feel these tensions, and it is really difficult. It is a challenge for us because we come to the task with a lot of questions, right? In thinking about the history of the tools that we've been dealing with, historicizing the tools, the procedures, etc. But the question I have is in the other direction. It's more in terms of the similarities, and you were touching upon this as you were talking about your experience of coding and part of your training in computer science, which has to do with the concept of the pleasure of the text in Hollenbach. And something that speaks to your example, which is the pleasure of the code, that is something that is an aesthetic experience that we have, an aesthetic pleasure that we derive from a piece of code and from the experience of coding, right? So if you could speak more about what you see in terms of similarities and how these two definitions would speak then to the materiality of the text from a literary perspective, and the materiality of code from the perspective of someone who is like really deep into the culture of programming, with all the discipline, the mental discipline that we know is part of this, that will prevent historical work to be done, but at the same time will allow for certain technical tasks to actually be accomplished, that we would put too many questions in front of on solving some technical questions, right? In a more utilitarian way. So if you could speak about that.
That's a fantastic question. It's making me think on the one hand about actually so literary critics have often argued right from the earliest stages of like digital studies, I'm thinking of Hales and Haraway and Mark Hansen and so on and so forth. They've often argued that competition, Hitler even, have often argued that competition is merely an acceleration of inscription. Because, I mean, again, to borrow from Kittler's famous dictum, there is no software, which is to say that everything is hardware, right? At the end of the day, something is being written somewhere. And that's kind of the rhetorical maneuver that they've pulled by, I'm saying they, like I'm also a literary critic. That's the rhetorical maneuver that we've pulled in trying to make this work happen, in trying to convince that the writing, the scene of writing in computation is a scene of writing. And here are scholars of writing who actually think about the two things together, right? I think the thing that really it enables for me, that whole trajectory of thought, which again, I think only partially answers the questions. I think there's like a number of other ways of looking at it that offered very different answers that definitely should be always considered next to that question of inscription. But nevertheless, I think what that question opens for me is this somewhat, I don't know how to actually judge it. All I know is that it's, I think, mildly unusual, if not more than that, that my first question upon encountering a piece of literature is always a skepticism that's rooted. Its uniqueness is often a skepticism that's rooted in questions of class and labor. And here's what I mean by that, is that when I encounter Lacan, theorizing like something really broad, right? Like it's like subjectivity as a thing, right? It's trans-historical, it's like everything. Great, excellent, you did that. But you used a literary example to do that. And there's a whole tradition of doing that, right? Like Freud does that, and like everyone else following that also does that. Like these are texts that like provide us with a rich wellspring of ideas from which to make those claims. I think what for me that equivalence means is that I have to tear down that notion of expecting one text to be better than the others. And as a result, my answer is often, well, you could have totally done this even with, or some variation of this, maybe your answer would be different, but you could have thought about these questions from, say, a programming folklore called The Story of Mel, right? It's from the bottom up in some ways. The bottom may be a different class bottom, but you can still think about those questions. It's in a different register. It's very similar for me, even when I'm like studying pop culture. I study memes and I study other stuff for my other parts of my project. And I think for me, because there is this kind of theoretical centrality to inscription on both technical and literary ends, it means that as someone who's committed to questioning the politico-economic and the social-cultural, it leads me to often question the kind of the unique sanctity of things, which is a huge problem, and I think can be thought about in different ways. So I'm not completely, married to the idea, but it's nevertheless, I think, something that's useful in purpose in times like these, like the example that I was just talking about.
Absolutely, I really like that answer, and made me think of also not just this. Well, say if you, like you said, instead of thinking from the point of view of higher literature, if you will, or Edgar Allan Poe, or literature that's supposedly universal, right? It's called universal literature. Or and you try to think about from the bottom up. There's also the possibility, I guess, or there's always the risk, I feel, that when we talk about technology, we, for some reason, adopt a sort of universal history point of view, right? As if technology is happening always at the same time everywhere in the world, right? And for example, recently, a philosopher called Yu Hui wrote a book like riffing off Martin Heidegger, the question concerning technology in China, right? And that is the whole idea of trying to give it a sort of more a richer or an alternative sort of cultural footing, right? And I was wondering if that comes into your work, and how often you think about that. Does it seem to you that these narratives of programming, of computing, are just thought of as like universal narratives? So, for instance, just an example of when I thought about looking into this intersection between anthropology and programming that I try to do, that's one of the things that worried me, and I thought, well, how can I cut this, right? How can I cut through this universal history that for any anthropology never makes a lot of sense, right? It makes you very suspicious. And my choice was, well, I'll cut it through language. Right? So the way I'll slice it through a programming language, in my case Ruby, and I'll focus on that, and that will be my way of cutting through it. It could have been something else. It could have been, for example, cutting it from a specific region of the world. It could have been from Brazil. Brazil has a lot of influence in several different moments in current, like contemporary software engineering. Could have been that. And I'm not saying one is better than the other at all. It's just ways of challenging, I guess, the universal narrative of technology. Yeah, does that make sense to you as well?
Totally. And I'm 100% with you on that. I think, and that's actually one of the problems with the sort of, general cultural conceptions of technology and the discourse around it, even a lot of critical discourse around it. So yeah, I was just finishing up a question concerning technology in China. It's kept right back there a couple of days ago, actually. I think it's fantastic. But I think, yeah, so that question could be extended regionally, question could be extended through specific practices, right? So people who study hackers like might just study hackers in one particular slice. And I think that's the more granular you get, the better answers you get. Or as I do it, I study it through sort of objects and histories, right? So and these things get intertwined, right? So when I write, for example, the history of the graphic card, I am not just looking at the sort of designers of the card. I'm looking at when it exploded. It is around the same time when like outsourcing of factories began in a certain way to a certain part of the world on a certain day. You can actually trace these things with great granularity. So any idea that somehow, I don't know, computer graphics are integral to how we understand computation and its illusions are pretty, start looking very shaky once you say, oh, well, these capacities to do this only emerged after the following factories came up because labor here went this way and that and so on and so forth. Similarly, I also contextualize personally within sort of, larger schematas of world systems. So what part of what kind of computation emerges at what time? And the thing that we call computing today is like not a monolithic thing. It's composed of these many fragments that come to us from different times and places and people in history and geography. And I think that any attempt to universalize things like that is, I hope, firmly in the past, as it were during, I don't know, Heidegger's time or maybe even Kittler's time. I think the era of a certain Western theoretical perspective that does not take into account some situatedness in history or geography or culture or practice is basically, I just hope it's behind us, right? Like it still happens, I think, and that's a problem, but that's a problem that I think we need to fix. And most of the work that I see happening now in some ways is fixing that, right? Like this includes stuff that you're talking about here, but also like almost everyone else I like talk to. I think those, again, which is not to in any way sort of, I think, discount the scope of that kind of work, either historical or theoretical. I think it could still say a lot about the world. It is just a little more careful with the world, right? Without even going to the world of many worlds part of stuff, you can still be very careful even when you say the world, right? And I think, yeah, actually anthropology's situatedness like does that really, really well. And I look up to sort of anthropological techniques precisely for some of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have one question that I don't know if I should ask now because it will take us into. do you have a follow-up question, Guilherme, or do you want?
Yeah, I've got about 3.5 million follow-ups. In the interest of time, you can, yeah. I don't know.
Should I ask? Okay,
yeah,
go. Mine is about subjectivity and subjectification. So for us to explore that a bit more, because I think that is from what I gather from this portion of your project now and something you have been working on and developing. I see that is part of the theoretical movement that you're doing in mobilizing Lacan and thinking about political economy as a different way of thinking about subjectivity in the context of computing. So one thing that I think is interesting in this conversation is that if we think about subjectivity and the process through which people become computer programmers, we know that we have these folk tales, the importance of text files, right? As the material form, the medium through which these stories would circulate. We have Ernst Menger's work on aptitude tests, right? Which is the moment in the 1950s where the profession is actually being organized around an industry, right? And creating a place for people who are going to become professional computer programmers. And we also have the folklore of hacker tests, right? Which are very important and are also part of the Usenet and that tradition on, right? So that is very much part of, we go through these text files as a process of subjectification that involves a process of identification and creation of the subject that takes us to interpolation. So that's my point. It was something I wanted to reflect with you about. So in thinking about subjectivity and subjectification, as you do this movement of taking Lacan, there's another figure in this conversation that is a person who incorporates Lacan, which is Althusser, right? And part of the same structuralist tradition, where the subject of ideology in Althusser is the Lacanian subject, right? But there's something more important there, because the subject for Althusser is not only the Lacanian subject of ideology, but is the subject of Marx. Right? And that takes you to political economy and to the conversation that you're interested in exploring and in the direction you're taking this. So I think this passage from subjectification, from the subjectivity to subjectification, to reconnect with the discussion about political economy, I think it is extremely powerful. And I think that's a direction where the scholarship is going. And it's a bit late, in the game, of course. But I wanted you to speak more about that with respect to the literary references that you have been talking about, because this is fantastic. What you're presenting to us is a moment in history where you have these figures of the computer programmer, who's kind of an ambiguous figure because you're part of as a tradition of hobbyists, and now you're part of the industry and the industry wants you, but you at the same time, you want to do low-level things. They want you to do high-level things. And then there's this idea of masculinity, of what it means to be working at a low level, right? That is still very present until today, right? Like these ideas of what it means to be like a bona fide hacker or programmer. So if you could speak more about that in your project in particular.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think you've actually basically touched on what is generally one of my larger interests. I have other work that more explicitly speaks to this question. I have a piece that actually thinks about how what's the relation between the psychoanalytic and the political economic subject within the context of computation. I have another piece that actually briefly in one of his maneuvers argues that Althusser's condition of interpolation is actually not sufficiently historicized even by Althusser, precisely because it doesn't take into account when exactly technologies emerge that allow that subject to be found in the first place, right? So think about the hail, hey you. Althusser's footnote in precisely that section actually says, oh, and once the subject is hailed, the police officer may ask for address papers. Address papers haven't existed in through the whole history, and that's my part on the history of addressability, where actually starting from computational addressability, I move backwards into the history of addresses as a concept. So addressing as a cultural technique and what that does.
Just a brief parenthesis on that. I've just going back to Althusser. It's not really to ask you to engage and go back into that direction and that political project, because we know of the limitations of the Althusser's approach, absolutely. And we know that there's a parallel project of Foucault, like drawing and criticizing that project. So it's not a request for engagement with Althusser whatsoever, but is that is a point, it's one of the bridges that will take you to the conversation of political economy. And Foucault is one of the ways, but through a more complicated relationship with the tradition of critical engagement of political economy, right?
I think you're like 100% right, and I completely agree. I think in this particular example that I was looking at, what really interests me is, so we already have some of these theorizations, right? So Tonghui Hu has theorized the emergence of user as a subjectivity. We have Nathan Enspenger's work on masculinity and computer boys takeover and this and that, as you rightly pointed out. We have a bunch of this work, early hacker systems being another one of that, where these questions are all in play. I think the specific subunit of it that I am interested in is precisely the professional one, right? Like, so there's the gender one, there is, I guess, the subjective one minus the professional one. The one that I'm interested in is the professional relationship between subjectivity and subjectification, or the interplay therein. I think the circuit between the two, I think for me, is much shorter than it is the circuit between Lacan and Althusser, or so on and so forth. But I think it's a fascinating moment. This is the moment where we should remember this is not the moment of the emergence of the profession, but this is the moment of the remembrance of the emergence of the profession, right? This is not the story in real time. It is someone looking back at when the profession emerges, which I think is actually more fascinating than like a real-time account of a profession emerging and dealing with its anxieties. It's the retrospective myth making of that professional anxiety that I think interests me, and is something that I'm like more sort of considerately thinking about. But I think you hit the nail on the head. Like that's essentially the circuit of ideas in which I'm sort of tensely and tersely jumping up and down.
Yes.
Brilliant. We've been going for half an hour. I wonder if we should wrap up, or if I should try a last question. I'm not sure. I guess not. Let's just keep it here, because it's been so, yeah, time just flew by. Yeah, I think I just want to thank you, Ranjodh, again for the participation, for being available, for the presentation, and for the chat.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Philippe. Thank you so much, Guilherme. I really, really enjoyed. I didn't even realize it had been 30 minutes. I thought it was like 10 minutes or something, but maybe I ranted a lot. But no, this was wonderful. I really enjoyed being here. Thank you so much for the invite. And I look forward to the larger conversation that emerges. This is really fascinating.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I think your presentation fits perfectly well within all of this discussion and all that we want to explore in this idea of like the limits of language and the limits of computation.
Yes,
so,
it is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to be continued.
Yeah, absolutely.
All the best. I'll see you on campus.
Yeah.